So that's classes, properties, and inheritance with TypeScript. And as I mentioned, these features also generally are supported in JavaScript, in modern JavaScript, of course, with the exception of type assignments and also with the exception of protected, private, public. These keywords are really only available in TypeScript. Now, it's not all what you can do with classes though. One other neat feature, which you also have in vanilla JavaScript and which is also supported in TypeScript, are getters and setters. Now, let's see that here on the accounting department, for example. Let's say there we have a last report property, which is a private property and it's of type string, so we have that. And then here we initialize this to be our reports property, or this argument we're getting here, there the first value, which of course is basically undefined if we pass in an empty reports array. Now when we add a report, then I want to set this last report equal to text, which is what we add to our reports array. Now last report is private, so we can access it from inside this method, but we won't be able to access it from outside with the dot notation. Now we can add a getter to still make it accessible. A getter is basically a property where you execute a function or a method when you retrieve a value, and that allows you as a developer to add more complex logic. Here, you create a getter by using the get keyword and then any name of your choice, typically closely related to the property you're trying to control the access to. For example, here, we could name it most recent report. Anything like that. Now important, this is defined like a method. So you add parentheses and then curly braces. And now in here, you have to return something. That's important. A getter method has to return something. So here we could return this last report, and then we kind of encapsulate this because this is publicly accessible now. But often you want to have more complex logic here. So here we could check if we have a value here. So if this is truthy, if it's not undefined, then we want to return last report. Otherwise, we might want to return some different logic. For example, let's say otherwise we throw an error message with throw new error, no report found. So now we added more logic, more complex logic to this property, and when we want to retrieve it, we can't directly retrieve this property through the dot notation, but we can use this as a property to in the end run this logic. So how would this work? Well, down there where I create my accounting department, before I add my report, if I try to console log accounting.mostRecentReport, and now important, accounting.mostRecentReport, and now important, you access this as a property. So no parentheses here. You don't execute this as a method. You just access it like a normal property. And behind the scenes, this will execute this method up there. So if I try this now, before we added a report, we'll see that this rebuilds without errors, recompiles without errors. But of course here, an error is thrown. It's our custom no report found error, because no report was added yet. And since using this as a getter accesses this method here and executes it, if we have no report, we don't make it into this if check or into this if statement, and therefore this line here kicks in. As an alternative, if we would move that down after we added a report, then of course we can save that and we no longer get an error, but instead we output this last report. So that's a getter. And you can also add a setter. A setter is added almost in the same way. You use the set keyword, and then again, any name of your choice, typically a name related to the property which should be set. So here I will reuse most recent report so that we can use this both to read a value and to set a value. And then again, you define this like a method, but now this needs to take an argument, the value which the user would have passed in. And here this should be a string value. And now in here you can run any logic you want to store this. Now here, since we're passing in a value for the most recent report, I in the end want to execute add report. So here a setter could simply be an alternative to the add report method. So in here we can access this add report, This is required since we're inside of the class. We refer to the class and then to this class method here. And now we can just forward value here. Now we could add a more complex logic and also check if value is maybe not defined, if it's falsy, and then just return or throw a new error where we say, please pass in a valid value. That is something we could also do. And now we're using a setter here as well. With that added, we can test it. Down there, I could add most recent report. I could access this on accounting. And just like this, we would read from it. But now by adding an equal sign, we're trying to set a value to that. And that will trigger this setter method. Again, just as before, we don't execute it as a method, but simply access it like a property. Now here, if I pass in an empty string, then we technically do pass in a string, but an empty string will be treated as falsy here, and therefore we should now get an error. So if I save this line of code, if I save the code with this line of code added, we indeed get this error, please pass in a valid value. If I do pass in a valid value though, if I say year-end report here, for example, and I now save this, now you will see this all works and year-end report is part of our reports list. So these are getters and setters, which can be great for encapsulating logic and for adding extra logic that should run when you try to read a property or when you try to set a property.